We often get a question of what's the best process for my glass? Where should I start? What's the best grit to start with? What's the best progression to take from a rough grind to a final polish? There is no real one routine that's going to fit every process. So today we're going to talk about good starting spaces. We've cast a big rectangular block out of this and I've cut it in half. Now this is going to show us two different things. Now I want this piece eventually to have polished sides where I'm going to bond some other things to it. Now this piece out of the mold is fairly rough on this surface. This side of the mold actually has some fairly big lips on it. Now I'm not going to try and grind these, although you probably could if you used a 45 grit. I'll probably cut these on a saw a little bit later just to take some of this material off. This will save our diamond disc from being ground too much. So right now I'm going to concentrate on this side of my mold. It's actually pretty flat to begin with, but it's got a lot of texture on here that I need to take down. Now there's a couple of ways I could start this, but what I want to take off enough material so I get rid of little things like this. Where you see it's not exactly flat there. I've got some concave areas there. So I'm going to take a fair amount of glass off of this. So I'm probably going to start this piece, since it's such a large surface area, with a 60 grit diamond disc. Now this is a 24-inch 60 grit diamond disc. This is considered a very rough grit. We do actually go a little bit rougher in our diamond discs, down to a 45 and also a 30 grit if you really got to remove some material. But a 60 grit's a pretty good starting step for most pieces. It's good for larger surface areas that are cast where you just have a little bit of glass to remove to flatten it. It's great for pieces that have broken off of a punty rod or a blowpipe. Now I'm going to be using our 24-inch Covington grinder. This is a variable speed grinder with a reversible motor, so the head will go both ways. It has a center water feed and also an external water feed. I'm going to be using the external water feed, so it gives you a good idea of how much water we're going to use for each grit disc that we're going to be showing you today. Now the diamond disc is going to have a 1-inch center hole in it. That's going to match up with our 1-inch center plug in the middle of our grinder. You really need to make sure that your discs are fitting flush on your grinder, otherwise your grinding is not going to work out that well. You're going to prematurely wear down your disc and you're not going to get a flat surface on your discs. When you put your disc on, you want to line it up with your center plug, and your discs bend a little bit. So it's easy to bend these just slightly so that your hole lines up and fits nice and flush over the top. So we got a nice flat surface adhesion there with our magnet. Now I'm going to turn on my grinder, and it'll take a few seconds for it to kind of spin up and get going. And this is a variable speed grinder, so I'm going to have it going probably about 3/4 speed, which is pretty fast. Now the faster diamond discs go, the more efficient they are. They'll grind things faster and they'll work faster. If you're not used to a diamond disc yet, you may want to slow it down a little. You'll sacrifice a little bit of efficiency in grinding, but you'll gain a lot more control over your grind. If it's going really, really fast and you're not used to it, you can sometimes remove more material from your glass than you really intend to. I'm going to adjust my water a little bit. Now I'm using this external water feed to give you an idea of how much water you need to use. On a rough grit like this, a 60 grit, you're going to want a fair amount of water on it because you're going to be removing a fair amount of glass. Now again, we're working this side of our mold cast piece. I don't have to take off a lot of material, but I'm looking to get past these little divots and creases here to get this bottom nice and flat. Now this is a brand new 60 grit, so you're going to see how quickly this is going to go. Now what I want to do with my diamond disc is I want to use the entire surface of the disc from the side to the center. That's going to keep my disc wearing evenly over the long term. What I'm also going to do is as I grind, every so often I'm going to pick up my piece and change direction. This is going to keep this surface as flat as possible. If you stay in one orientation, you'll generally push harder in one area than another, and you'll end up making the surface unflat. So let's give this a try. Now I'm going to make a 1/4 turn. You can see it's removed a lot of material already, but I have several little divots and spots that still need to be removed. It does not take much. That's looking pretty good, but I've got some areas in the side right here. And that's looking nice and flat. Let's take a look. Now you'll see here on my flat, I've gotten rid of all of my side divots. I've got some edge chipping going along here, and that's pretty typical of a 60 grit. It's going to be a little more aggressive, so you're going to get some chipping out of the edges. This will clean up on finer grits. But as a start, this is great. It didn't take long. It flattened out this surface nicely. If you'll also notice, when I was making my quarter turns, I stopped in the center at the last turn, and you can see all my scratches on the surface are going in the same direction. This will come in handy on our next step for making sure that we removed all our scratches from this rougher grind. Now we're again going to take a look at our glass block here, and you can see a little bit up close, all my scratches are going in this direction. So what I'm going to do when I put this on our 140 grit disc, I'm going to put this down so the scratches will be going in the same direction. Now as I make my quarter turns and I end up here, the scratches from the 140 grit disc will be going in this direction, which you'll now notice will be perpendicular to the scratches left by our 60 grit. This will be a very easy way to find out if I've removed all these deeper scratches from this 60 grit. Let's give this a try. Make my quarter turn. Another quarter turn. And my final quarter turn. And again, I'm going to stay in one spot for a few seconds just to get all my scratches going in the same direction. Now you'll see with my 140 grit disc, all my scratches are now going in this direction, which is perpendicular to what my 60 grit was in this direction. So now you'll be able to easily see if you have any leftover scratches going perpendicular to these. And you'll be able to know if you've gotten past all your 60 grit scratches. It's very important if you go multiple stages to make sure you remove rougher grit scratches from the first steps. So now that we've gone through our 140 grit disc and you can see our scratches are all going in this direction, we're going to do the same thing on our 270 grit disc here. So I'm going to put this piece down so that the scratches on my 270 start in the same orientation. Then as I make my quarter turns, I will end up again with scratches from my 270 grit being perpendicular to the scratches left by my 140 grit. Let's take a look. Again, I'm using the entire surface of the disc. And if you see a lot of buildup of glass developing on your disc, you need to add a little bit more water. You don't want to add too much water on a finer grit disc like a 270, otherwise you'll start hydroplaning, which means you'll float above the surface of the diamonds and they won't grind efficiently for you. Now again, I'll stop for a few seconds in one place. Let me clean this off. And you'll see I've got a much finer surface. Now I do have some deeper scratches right here, which is indicative of either having something underneath my 270 grit or the fact that I was hydroplaning a little bit. Now this is a newer grit 270, so it can be a little temperamental. So I've adjusted my water a little bit and I'm going to grind this surface again. This time I'm doing the same thing, starting with the scratches going in the same direction, so that by the time I'm done they'll be perpendicular and I'll see if I've gotten out this deeper scratch. Let's wash this off and take a look. Now that's a much more uniform surface, and I'm not sure if you can see from this, but I can see little pits along through here from my previous scratches from the 270. So I have not gone far enough to get out those deeper gouges the 270 had done. I know it's difficult to see from the video, but I can see them here. So I'm going to have to go a little bit further on this, and I'm going to do the same thing, starting with the orientation that I had previously, with the scratches going in this direction, because I'm still trying to get out these earlier scratches. Now you can see I've cleaned it up quite a bit. I don't see any of the deeper scratches from my previous grit. Now 270 grit, 200 grit, 325 grit, these can all be very, very finicky with larger surface area pieces like this. This is why we often consider going to a 220 grit smoothing pad after this to clean up any random deep scratches you may see on a 270 grit, as the finer grits sometimes have a harder time with larger surface areas. Now for a pre-polish step, this is a 325 grit smoothing pad. It's a resin bonded diamond, so the diamonds will move around on the surface of the pad as you grind, which gives a finer surface than what the actual grit of the pad is. These will wear out faster than your typical electroplated pads. You'll go through about 3 or 4 of these in the lifespan of your regular electroplated discs. The nice thing about them is once a smoothing pad wears out, it's a great addition to your workflow. So you can go from a new smoothing pad to a worn out smoothing pad, and it'll cut your polish time in half. We're going to line up our pad over our center plug. Because like every other disc, you want to make sure they're nice and flush with the wheel head. With our water, we're going to have a nice steady stream. Since this pad is new, it will also do a very nice job of cleaning up the surface from our larger block. Now if you do a lot of large work, you may want to consider going to a 220 grit smoothing pad before your 325 grit. It'll really cut down on your polish time on larger surface areas. Now here's our larger block. I'm going to run the same process again. All my 270 grit scratches are going in this direction, so that's where I'm going to start with my 325 grit smoothing pad. As with every other disc, you want to use the whole surface of the pad to keep it all wearing evenly. You see I'm developing a little bit of ground glass building up on the pad, so I may want to increase my water just a little bit. Here's my final turn. Let's wash this off and take a look. So here's my block. It's looking pretty good, but I can see up in here, I've got some little pitting, and that's the deeper scratches that I haven't gotten out yet from the 270 grit. That's a great way to see it. So once again, I'm going to start this direction on my smoothing pad and see if I can get out these deeper scratches here. Making my quarter turns, being sure to try and use the entire pad. And stopping for a few seconds in one spot right before the end. Now this is looking pretty good. I don't see any deeper scratches in there or pitting. Got a nice surface to work with. That's a pretty good pre-polish, but this being a new smoothing pad, this is going to be a pretty aggressive surface to try and polish from. Now for our final polish stage, this is an LP66 pad, and it's just a carrier. It will not polish the glass by itself. You actually need to use cerium oxide with either this or the synthetic felt pad. Now the best way to work these is once you first get these pads, you're going to have your cerium oxide powder. This is Ceroptic. I'm going to take my pad, put it on my wheel head. It doesn't have to be perfectly on there. We're just going to leave it on there to charge it up. Now what I'll do is I'll take some of my cerium powder and just put a little bit on the disc. Now once I have some cerium on my disc, I can spread it around a little bit like this. I'm going to add a little bit of water to my disc. And what I'm going to do is just make a thin mud consistency out of my cerium. I'm going to spread it all over the surface of my polishing pad. And you don't have to use a lot of cerium, you just want to cover the surface. Get it really worked into the surface there. And what I'm going to do, I'll leave this overnight now. So I've got a nice little layer of my cerium on there. This will dry overnight, and then my LP66 pad will absorb a lot of this cerium and get it into its structure. So when I go to polish tomorrow, my first day, it'll already have a little bit of cerium in the structure of the pad. So today you can see I'm all dolled up in our nice vinyl apron for our His Glass Works shop experience, because today we're going to talk about polishing your glass. Now, polishing your glass, we've talked about our synthetic felt pads, our LP66 pads. Right now I have an LP66 pad on this disc, and we've put some cerium on it, let it sit overnight so it's dried on there, so it's pulling into the pore structure of the LP pad, so we'll have a little bit of charging going on. This is a brand new LP66 pad, so the polishing time is going to take a little bit longer. Now, in general, your polish time is going to take as long as all of your other steps together. So let's say if you went through our 60 grit, 140 grit, 270 grit, and 325 grit smoothing pad, and it took you 15 to 20 minutes to do a piece on that, depending on the size of your piece, you can pretty much guarantee that it's going to take you 15 to 20 minutes to polish that piece on your polishing pad with cerium oxide. It's not the fastest step in the world, but it's your final step, and you really want it to work well, so don't get impatient with it. So we're using our Ceroptic cerium oxide, and it's a powdered cerium. You can see in here, we've used quite a bit of it for different projects already. But this is a high quality cerium oxide. It's about 99% pure cerium, so it's a great quality. We've already mixed a little bit and put it into a little slurry on our pad, and you can see it's very dry on the surface of our LP pad now. We've allowed it to dry overnight. What we're going to do now with our cerium oxide is mix it into a little squirt bottle. And we have a tiny little squirt bottle here, and we filled it about a third of the way full with our powdered cerium. A good ratio for mixture of cerium is about 1 part cerium to 2 parts water. So we're going to mix this up real quick. And we'll just use our water here from our grinder. So we've got a good mixture of water in there. I'm going to cap that off and shake it up. Now, most ceriums will have a little bit of suspension treatment to them, so they will stay in suspension. The Ceroptic does not have any suspension treatment to it, so as it sits in water, the cerium oxide will settle back down to the bottom of your container. So every time you pick this up and use it, you'll need to shake it up again to get it back in suspension. All right, so we've got a little bit of cerium there. Let's try our hand at some polishing. So we've got our wheel going. I'm going to add a little bit of water to our pad just to get it moist. Now, you don't need a lot of water running on your cerium pad on your polishing stage. You just need enough water to make sure the surface stays moist. Now, here's my block that I've rough ground from my 60 grit, my 140 grit, my 270 grit, and now into a smoothing pad. This is the block that I'm going to polish now on my LP66 pad. Now, if you'll remember, with all of our diamond grits, we always said stay in one position, move back and forth to the center of the edge, and keep a very uniform quarter turn so your scratches were always going in the same direction. When you get to a polishing stage, you want to be a little bit different. The most effective polishing is when you're constantly changing direction from your polishing pad on the bottom of your glass. This is most easily done if you make a 360 degree in the opposite direction of the way that your polishing pad is spinning. Let's give this a try real quick and we'll see how much cerium is on the pad. Now, as you're polishing, what you're looking for is a little bit of milky water buildup here. That's a good sign that you have enough water and enough cerium on your polishing pad to accomplish your polish. If you're getting a little bit of water buildup along the edge of your piece and it looks sort of milky, then you're doing pretty well. So this pad, I've already charged with a little bit of cerium, but I haven't had to add any more cerium to it yet while I'm polishing. Now I'll change direction a little bit on this. And remember, as we stated, the polishing step is going to take at least as long as all of your other steps combined. So plan on being here a little while. Don't expect to get a perfect polish out of this right away. Especially when these pads are new, your diamond discs are going to be fairly aggressive, and your polishing pad will not have a whole lot of cerium charged up in it. So it may take a while for you to get a really good polish out of these. A medium amount of pressure on this. I'm not really leaning on it. You could if you wanted to, but I'm just giving enough pressure so that there's friction between the cerium and the glass from the LP pad. So here's my squirt bottle of cerium, making sure it's shaken up well. And I'm just going to squirt a little bit in the middle of my pad. And you can see, even as I'm going around my disc, I'm trying to use the entire surface of the disc, moving from the outside edge of the pad to the inside diameter of the pad. Because you still want to use this pad as evenly as possible so you don't dig any channels into your polishing pads. Add a little bit more cerium. So we're looking at about 5 minutes of polishing time, and I'm starting to get a little bit of a reflective surface on this. So you can see this is going to take a while. You can see the light's reflecting on the surface. Now I still have a lot of haze on this surface from the smoothing pad. The smoothing pad was very new, it's very aggressive, and the polishing pad is extremely new and doesn't have much cerium charged into it. Now you see I've reduced my water down to just a slight drip on the pad. The pad is definitely moist enough. It's still quite wet on here. I can still see nice buildup of cerium along the edges. So I don't need nearly as much water on here. Now you'll also see that you can do things on a polishing pad that I wouldn't recommend on a diamond disc, like going over the edge or staying in one spot and moving it around a little. All these things are perfectly acceptable on a polishing pad because you want to have a lot of different movements on the polishing pad, so you're getting in lots of different areas. Now this is about 16-17 minutes worth of polish time, and I've got a pretty nice surface on there. It's nice and polished. I can see all the way through it. Now I do have some rougher areas on some of the edges that I didn't quite get out all of my 270 grit scratches or my smoothing pad scratches. So it's got to go a little bit further, but the majority of the actual surface is nice and polished. See a nice reflection of our fluorescent bulbs in there, and of course you can see straight through it. So it took about as long as it took to grind it to polish it. And this is a brand new LP pad, so it doesn't have a lot of cerium on there, and our discs were brand new, so they were a lot more aggressive than they normally are. So both these things will improve with time. So you'll actually spend a little bit less time on the polish, but that did a pretty nice job. In about the same time it took to grind all the steps, I was able to get a really nice polish out of this.